Friends, our second lesson comes from the Gospel of Mark, the 7th chapter. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't think we realize what it was like to follow Jesus. Everywhere he went, crowds surrounded, enveloped him. Not a day went by without people grabbing at him, running after him, waiting on his every move, his every word. The rich, the poor, the lame, the leprous, the dying, the sick, the demon-possessed, the educated, and the illiterate, all wanting a piece of him, all so curious to know who this man is. Just before the story I read in Mark's Gospel for today, Jesus was up to his usual business, and the crowds were surrounding him as usual. Some of the pastors and religious leaders decided that they were going to use Jesus' fame to their advantage. See, the Pharisees wait until the opportune moment to put Jesus on the spot. 4 chapters before this moment, Mark has already told us that the Pharisees were out to destroy Jesus. And so as the crowds swell around him, the Pharisees speak up and ask a question. "Hey, Jesus, why do your disciples eat with unclean hands?" Now, to our modern ears, this is an odd question. But within the lives of the people of Israel, cleanliness was of the utmost significance for daily life. Cleanliness was required by the sacred teachings of God in the Old Testament. In order to attend worship at temple or at synagogue, one had to be ritually clean. In order to eat food with one's friends, one had to be ritually clean. In order to exist in daily community with the Jewish people, one had to be ritually clean. We often mischaracterize these as arbitrary rules, but to the Jewish people, these were and still are God's commands for how to live the good life. Commands that carve out the people of Israel as God's particular, special, chosen people through whom the salvation of the world will occur. But of course, the Pharisees' question is not really about Jesus' disciples washing their hands before dinner. It is deeper than that. Because in a time when the unclean non-Jewish Romans were ruling the entire land, the Pharisees were becoming worried that the Jewish people were becoming less and less like God's people and more like the pagan nations that surrounded them. See, ultimately, this question to Jesus is about religious and political allegiance. Does Jesus think God's words and laws even matter? Is he teaching a religion that is slowly getting rid of what is sacred and is turning toward what is secular, they wonder? Is he breaking with our tradition, our way of life, the way that we have lived and carried on for centuries? All of this tension and suspicion leads the Pharisees into being the equivalent of first-century Facebook trolls. They are trying to get Jesus to say just the wrong thing in public about the hot-button issues of the day so that his name will be tarnished and his ministry will be destroyed. So the Pharisees are trying to make a fool out of Jesus because, frankly, he hasn't been following the rules in the way that they would like. What they're really worried about is not how he eats, but who he eats with. And the truth is, the rumors have spread. Galilee was not a large county. Jesus has been eating with all of the wrong people. He's been eating with sinners and tax collectors and the sick and the dying. But Jesus doesn't take the bait. Instead, he flips the whole conversation on its head. Clean and unclean, says Jesus, is not about what you put into your body. It's not about following a set of right rules. It has nothing to do with who you eat with. It's about how we speak. It's about how we live. It's about our character. It's about what is in our hearts. Clean and unclean, those categories, says Jesus, is about who we are as God's people. I imagine, as he says this, the crowd quickly hushes. The Pharisees stand with their mouths gaping wide open. How dare Jesus reinterpret the holy teachings of God like that? But before they can answer him, Jesus quite rudely gets up, leaves the entire debate behind him, and leaves the crowds. Apparently, Jesus was quite annoyed with this conversation because he doesn't just take a moment to cool off by himself. Instead, he hikes 35 miles northeast to a foreign land called Tyre. Jesus' choice destination, honestly, is a bit offensive. Offensive because the non-Jewish inhabitants of Tyre and the people of Israel have shared a complex and problematic history up to this point. In a traumatic historical event rivaling 9/11, the Babylonian armies had marched into Jerusalem in the year 587 BCE and burned and destroyed everything in its path. Thousands of Jews were killed. Thousands became POWs in a foreign land some 600 miles away. It was during that time, in that particular moment, that the inhabitants of Tyre sold their souls and betrayed the Jewish people to the Babylonian armies. To say that the people of Israel hated the people of this region where Jesus goes is an understatement. The people of Tyre were absolutely the enemies of God and the enemies of God's people. The scripture that was read today, that Laura read, gave us a glimpse of Israel's hate for this region and people. In it, God tells the inhabitants of this region that he will wipe them off the face of the earth and send them down into the pit of the deep. Harsh words. All of this history, all of this strife and anger of the past between the Jewish people and the people of Tyre is reverberating off the walls of this text as Jesus journeys right into the middle of it. All of that emotion is weighing on Jesus and his disciples as they walk. I think all of this tension explains why the disciples, who are often very happy to share their opinions with Jesus and what they think, are completely silent throughout the entire story. They don't even mutter a word. I imagine that as Jesus crosses into the wrong part of town, his disciples begin to exchange looks at one another behind his back. The kind of looks that say, "What in the world is this person doing? Are they out of their mind?" These are the kind of looks that me and my sisters used to share together in the back seat of our car about our parents. Some of you may have experience with that. Jesus gets to the city and stops at a house where he wants to be left alone. As Mark says, Jesus didn't want anyone to know that he was there. Mark here possibly hinting at the fact that even Jesus is nervous about what his Jewish presence might bring in this city. The disciples, for a moment, feel relieved, because for now, nobody has seen them in this foul place. But they are not comfortable for long, because a woman whose daughter, Mark says, has an unclean spirit, she has heard that Jesus has come to town. Mark usually tells his stories with little detail, but in this instance, he goes out of his way to tell us that this is no ordinary woman. No, she is a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin whose daughter is unclean. Mark's story, as he describes this woman, is dripping with irony, because just after Jesus has debated the Pharisees at length about how to define what is clean and what is unclean, he travels into the most unclean land imaginable. No longer is clean and unclean a mere conversation topic for Jesus, because there is an unclean woman standing right in front of him. In the first century world, to the Jewish people, this woman has several strikes against her. Strike one, they would have thought that she is the wrong gender. It was known in the first century that prominent Jewish teachers like Jesus were not allowed to speak to women in public, especially not foreign women. Strike two, she was the wrong religion. As a Gentile, she is not a worshiper of Israel's God and is therefore a pagan, the kind of person a Jewish parent would warn their children against. Strike three, she is the wrong ethnicity. Not only is she a Gentile, but Mark uses this odd and old term, Syro-Phoenician, to describe her. She is a descendant of those evil people of Tyre we heard about in the book of Ezekiel, whom God would wipe off the face of the earth because they betrayed Jesus' people. This is a person whom the Jewish people would be most prejudiced against. And strike four, perhaps the greatest strike against her, she is unclean. She is exactly the person that the Pharisees are worried about Jesus spending time with. Given all these strikes against her, Jesus should tell her to go and get lost. I'm sure his disciples expected him to do so, but instead, Jesus stands there looking toward her. He sees her suffering. He sees a parent desperate to save her child who cries out and begs for healing. And then come the most powerful words in the entire story. He said to her. He said to her. Jesus refuses to let the hatred of his people, the categories of clean and unclean spoken of by the Pharisees, even the prophecies of destruction from the book of Ezekiel, keep him from encountering the pain of this woman. As he looks at her and speaks, his voice cuts through centuries of unrest, centuries of anger and hate, clouds of cultural stigma and taboo, cuts through the anger of his people. Jesus' voice embodies a new way forward, embodies the promise of the prophets that one day the Messiah would come and he would speak and the nations would be healed. Jesus' initial words in the conversation, "It is not fair to give the children's food to the dogs," have puzzled many. puzzled me this week. Some scholars have suggested that in them Jesus is rudely reluctant to honor this woman's request because she is a Gentile. Maybe, but more significant than that, Mark is getting at the point that rather than debate with her like a Pharisee would, Jesus enters into dialogue, to conversation. Jesus speaks to an unclean woman, and in so doing offers her the dignity to speak back at him. If you want to begin healing division and strife, Jesus suggests beginning with a conversation. What the woman says next is astounding. "Sir, even the dogs eat the children's crumbs." Now, "sir" does not get even close to the amazing thing that is going on here. A better translation is Lord. She calls him Lord. Lord is the Greek translation of the Hebrew name of God, the name Yahweh, the name that Jews even to this day are hesitant to speak out loud, the name that God reveals to Moses at the burning bush and says, "This is my name forever. Call me Lord." Jesus' reaction tells us that something remarkable has happened. "Because you have said this, your daughter, she is healed." Not only is this unclean foreign woman the only person to call Jesus Lord in the entire gospel, but elsewhere, when this word is used, it is used to describe who God is and what God does. This outsider, this woman, sees what the insiders, the disciples, the religious scholars, the churchgoers, the clean Jews are too blinded by their tradition to see. That in front of her stands not a mere man, but Jesus, Son of the living God, the Lord, the healer of all things and all people. This woman gets what the whole gospel story is about. Seeing Jesus for who he really is. The summer after my first year of seminary, I was working with people with intellectual disabilities. During my first week, I was taking a group to a park to play down the street. As we came near the park, I noticed a black gentleman who was walking across the road, pacing dangerously and yelling at the top of his lungs. His eyes were glazed over as if possessed by something. I remember thinking, "All right, Josh, this is your first week as an intern. Just get the people to the park safely," right? So I told our participants, don't pay any attention to him. If I'm honest, in that moment, I thought that man was unclean. He was someone that I wanted nothing to do with. But then one of our participants, who was born with Down syndrome, Amy, walked into the wrong part of the road toward him. I was terrified. And then she said to him, "What is your name?" His demeanor completely changed. His eyes softened. He said, "My name is Mose." She said, "I'm Amy. I know you're sad, but it's going to be okay. Let's be friends. It's going to be okay." What I learned that day, what the disciples learned in the region of Tyre with Jesus, is that whether we want to admit it or not, there are people in our world that we have been taught to deem unclean. Following Jesus, friends, will bring us at times to people and to places that we would rather not be. Face to face with our own prejudices, face to face with our enemies, with people with whom we would rather not associate, to worship with people we would rather not have in our building. I want you to picture the last person that you would expect to know who God is. Picture that person in your mind. Picture the last person that you would ever imagine would call Jesus by the true name Lord. A person who is unclean to you, undeserving, unfitting, unworthy of God's love. Picture that person. That person is the woman in Mark's story. I wonder, if Jesus came to Salisbury, which part of town, which unclean place, which unclean person would he have a conversation with, even if it would embarrass us, disciples? We may not always know what it was like to follow Jesus, but here in Mark's gospel, in this story for today, as we do, we are asked a challenging question. If we do not journey with Jesus all the way to those unclean places, to those unclean people, then how will we know who Jesus is?